read in 1 Samuel this morning. In 1 Samuel, the 13th chapter, Saul had been king for a very short time, and he's facing one of the great challenges the Philistines are mustering against him. In fact, he and his son go and they attack fortification of the Philistines, and that makes the Philistines really mad, and so they gather a huge army to go out against them. And the text, it tells us that that army was 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and troops like sand. Earlier in the passage, Saul's army was 3,000 men. So they were completely outmanned, and the people of Israel were running away from the Philistines. They were coming to get them. And Saul offers a sacrifice to God at that time in order to gain God's favor, as we see in that chapter. And Samuel comes and confronts him and says to him, "What is this that you've done?" And Saul gives us a picture of his reasoning about why he offered that sacrifice at that time. And his reasoning mostly has to do with the immediate circumstances that were happening at that moment, at that time. He had waited 7 days for Samuel to come. And he says, now with the Philistines gathered for war in Michmash, and here we are, the people are scattering. They're running away. It had already mentioned in the text, if you recall, that they were hiding anywhere they could hide, in holes, in tombs, in crypts. They were hiding in the holes in mountains. They were going anywhere they could. And at this point, the people are scattering. So what little army he had was going away. The second thing he mentioned is that you didn't come when you were supposed to. You told me this appointed time and you didn't show up, and what am I supposed to do now when everyone's going away and the Philistine army is huge and they're ready to fight? So I'm looking at this situation, essentially is what Saul is thinking, and I've got to do something. And he says, and I have not sought the favor of Jehovah. Now, Saul's motive in doing this is a good thing, isn't it? That he wants God's favor. I think we can all understand why. The chances of his army of 3,000 men was not going to win a battle against the Philistines just based on weaponry and men and things like that alone. So Saul is essentially saying the right thing. I want God's favor as I go through this. It's a good thing. But his zeal has led him beyond what's right, and he admits that when he says, and so I force myself. And I think the translation that Julian read said, I felt compelled. And I kind of like that felt in there. I think one of the other translations uses that same thing. I felt compelled. That feeling in him where this is a necessary thing. I need God's favor or we're going to lose the battle. And not only are we going to lose the battle, but it's going to be a disaster. Right? This is going to be the end. I need God's favor. I need God's salvation. How can I get his favor? We all know what pleases God. Sacrifices please God. So I have to do this if this battle is going to be won. Is this type of reasoning still common? Where people look at themselves in various circumstances and they think to themselves, how can I please God? What can I do for God? And they get to a point, depending on the circumstances, that says, I have to do this. I'm forcing myself to do this. Paul talked about the Israelites in Romans, the 10th chapter. And Romans, the 9th chapter, actually is a beautiful passage where Paul is explaining the relationship that he has with the Israelites and his desire for their salvation. And so the 10th chapter begins with this beautiful statement. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. This is an incredible passage. It's in many ways, it's a reminder not just about what can happen to the Israelites, but what can happen to us very easily if we're not careful. The first thing that I notice about this passage is it tells me that being zealous for God doesn't necessarily mean that I'm right or not, that I'm saved. Paul says, I'm praying for them to be saved, which means they're not going to be saved, right? So, his consideration of his brethren is moving to me. I hope it's moving to you also. Because these are the Israelites. These are the ones who had so often persecuted and hurt Saul. These are the ones who had done some unmentionable things to him over and over again. And yet he says of the people of Israel that he prays for them. And deep in his heart, he wants them to be saved. We need to be moved by that very attitude. And it just almost as an aside for the real point of the lesson, but it's so important. Consider how important it is that we pray for souls to be saved. Not just the ones that we're friendly with, but the ones that sometimes are difficult around us. Many of the people in this world are sincere and they're devout and they're striving to serve God as well as they can. We need to be careful that we don't write them off in some way or consider them as enemies that need to be destroyed. Paul is saying of the Israelites, I want them to be saved. And that's why he kept going. That's why part of what he kept doing is he went to the synagogues to teach. Brethren, we need that kind of attitude. So he says of the people of Israel, they have a zeal for God. Let's focus for a moment on the fact that it's important that we have our zeal directed in the right direction. Zeal, we can have zeal for all the wrong things. Too often we are zealous for the wrong things, whether it's our career or politics or the country or sport or fashion or whatever it is that moves you. Sometimes, whether it's selfish or not, sometimes we need to be careful that we too have a zeal for God. But even a zeal for God can be misdirected. And it's amazing how easily we can deceive ourselves about our zeal for God. It reminds me of what Jesus said in John the 16th chapter, and in verse 2, as he's warning the disciples about what's going to happen when he leaves them. He says to them, of the Jews, they will put you out of the synagogues. Indeed, the hour is coming when whoever kills you will think that he is offering service to God. So the Israelites who have the law that says you shall not commit murder feel like it's okay to murder in service to God. How do you get from one point to the other? Well, often it's a misguided zeal. They thought they were serving God, but in fact they weren't. And who's the example that we think of for this? It's Saul the Pharisee, isn't it? In fact, when he was talking to King Agrippa, you can read this in Acts the 26th chapter. He says to King Agrippa, I myself was convinced, key on that word, I was convinced that I ought to do many things in opposing the name of Jesus of Nazareth. I did so in Jerusalem. I locked saints into prison, given authority from the priest. I voted against them for death. I punished them, he says, in the synagogues. I tried to make them blaspheme. He says, in a raging fury, I persecuted them. In that time, did Paul think that he was offering service to God? He had convinced himself this was the right thing for him to do. Excuse me. When he wrote to the Galatians, in Galatians, the first chapter, verses 13 and 14, you can see that attitude and how he understood. Galatians, the first chapter, verses 13 and 14. Galatians 1. He says, "For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted through the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers." And we understand what's happening here. Not only do we see that persecution, not only do we see the praise he was getting from those who are around him for the things he was doing, so that he was advancing beyond them. I was extremely zealous for... Was he zealous for God? In his mind, the answer is yes. He absolutely was zealous for God. But in this passage, he makes it clear. He equates being zealous for God with being zealous for the traditions of the elders, of his fathers. Those traditions were old. They were accepted as true. And so for Paul, when he says, I convinced myself that I needed to do this, and then he went after it so zealously, he was doing this in service to God. That was his picture. He was zealous for God. Sometimes we can end up doing the same kind of thing, where we substitute some kind of busyness or action for obedience of faith that comes from the heart. We define our zealousness by I'm at every assembly, and that becomes our standard. We're doing what other people have defined as faithfulness, or it doesn't matter what it is. Being zealous for God means that our focus has to be on Him. And the key that I'm seeing in these verses is, notice how easily we are deceived in these things. Was King Saul zealous for God when he offered that sacrifice? Clearly he was. And yet it was misdirected. So for that to be true, that means we've got to learn to have a zeal that honors God. And what does that require? Zeal that honors God, according to Paul in this passage, requires knowledge. They have a zeal for God, he says, but not according to knowledge. And of course, we have to admit that means it's got to be the right kind of knowledge, correct? The Israelites thought they knew God. Paul, in one of his letters, would say, in essence, that they knew it better than anyone because they had the promises, they had the law, they had the prophets, they had all the writings. God had revealed all of this to them. There's a sense in which they should have known better than all these things. But too often they didn't. Consider the Sadducees. If you go to Mark, the 12th chapter, verses 18 through 27, you can read about the time that they come to Jesus with their argument about why there is not a resurrection. And it had to do with the Levirate marriage. And they said, well, if a man has a wife and they don't have children, the wife dies before there's children, the brother has to marry the wife. And they go down, there's 7 of them, they never produce. And in the end, in heaven, whose wife is she going to be? And what does Jesus answer to them? He says, is this not the reason that you're wrong? Because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. That had to hit them like a ton of bricks, because they've got this argument based on this passage about the Levirate marriage. You don't really find much about it. Deuteronomy 24, I think. I mean, it's just one little paragraph maybe. And they had this whole argument about, this shows there's no resurrection. And he said, nope. You don't know the scriptures. What does that mean, they don't know the scriptures? Clearly they knew the words that were in the scriptures, but they didn't truly comprehend what they meant, did they? He said, you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. And he goes on to answer some other things, but that's what I wanted us to focus on there. Did they know? Yes. But did they really have a knowledge of God and of God's righteousness? And the answer to that question is, no, they didn't. What about the Pharisees? Were they any better? Matthew 23 would argue to us that no, in fact, they didn't. Recognize in Matthew 23, verse 5, it tells us that all the Pharisees would make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. Now, this is part of the old law. Jesus had phylacteries and fringes on his clothing because that was in the law, and he followed the law. But did they understand the purpose of the phylacteries and the fringes? The verse tells us they really did it, because that said they did it to be seen of men. So they made it broad to make themselves look more righteous, but that had nothing to do with real righteousness, did it? Did they have knowledge? Yes. But it wasn't a knowledge that helped them. He says later in Matthew 23 that they would travel across sea and land to make one proselyte, and then they would end up twofold as much child of hell. They would tithe mint and dill and cumin. Was that a part of God's law? Absolutely. Tithing everything that was in the house. You give 1/10. And yet they neglected the weightier matters of the law. They had knowledge, but they didn't use the knowledge correctly. They built tombs, it says. They built up tombs for the prophets and monuments for the righteous. That one they went too far. That wasn't what God had told them to do. We need to be careful then about the knowledge, because that's one of the things that we think of ourselves also. We think of ourselves as people who know the Bible. We spend our time studying it. We read it. We go over it over and over and over again. We know it. Is it possible for us to have a zeal for God, but without knowledge? That even though we study it, that we don't know the power of the Scriptures? And unfortunately, the answer is absolutely. We can end up in that same situation as they did. Earlier in Romans, Paul tells us that the righteousness of God has been manifest. This is in the 3rd chapter, verses 21 through 26. And in that passage, he emphasizes that the righteousness of God that's been manifest and revealed to us is in Jesus Christ. That we're justified by him, that we have redemption in him, that we receive that by faith. Too often we go astray in the things that we think are vital. Focus on the knowledge that is revealed by God. I like how we see this in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew the 5th chapter, verse 20. And remember, he told the people there, he said, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. You have to be more righteous than the people who spend all their time trying to be righteous. And then the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, he helps us understand what righteousness is. He helps us understand about how do we deal with anger and lust and deceit and vengeance and hatred, and how we should worship God from our hearts and the choices that we make in life, and be careful about the false prophets. Like Saul, we have to beware of having a knowledge that is filtered through the traditions of our fathers. Because that can happen to us just as easily as it did them. So that no matter how clever their arguments were, they didn't really know the Scriptures. They didn't really know the power of God. They didn't really know the truth. They didn't really know the Father or even Christ. We have to have a knowledge that comes from God. Beware. Beware, because it takes a lot of effort. The second thing I see in this passage is that zeal that honors God requires humility. So we're told in verse 3 by Paul that they were seeking to establish their own righteousness, and so they didn't follow the righteousness of God. What does it mean to establish your own righteousness? I'll tell you, the first thing that comes to my mind is I would know it if I was doing it, right? Most of us too careful to allow something like that happen to us. Certainly Jeroboam, who's the king at the same time as Rehoboam. Right after Solomon, you remember the kingdom split between the north and the south. Jeroboam was the king in the north, and he decided that he was going to set up 2 new idols, golden calves for them to worship, 2 new places for them to worship, new priests, new temples, new feasts. He had it all figured out. And the text in 1 Kings 12, it says that he had devised from his own heart. And that's what it means to establish your own righteousness. Things that you devise from your own heart. And our society in particular is very keen for things that come from the heart. We judge almost everything that if your heart tells you it's okay, it must be okay. And over in the scriptures, we're reminded that the heart is deceitful above all things. We tend to think of our own conjectures as more valid than what's revealed. And I know that's a prejudicial term. My conjectures are my reasoned arguments about why this is true. Right? We ask ourselves the question, how can I be pleasing to God? If you ask the people in the world, how can you be pleasing to God? What kind of answers are you going to get? Well, if you do more good than bad, don't be radically evil, then God's going to approve of you, because God knows that we're human. He understands our frailty. He doesn't expect too much of us. Do people reason like that? Some would reason love is the answer. Love, love, love. And that's all they talk about. And the only way that you need to do to please God is to be loving, because God is love. Do just exactly what you're commanded to do. And so you end up being very particular about following the law precisely, because God wants us to obey. Are all those statements true, that God knows that we're human? That God is love and God wants us to obey? Yeah, but people come to varying conclusions. They establish their own righteousness based on that. I love Paul's warning in the book of Colossians, the 3rd chapter. No, the 2nd chapter. Colossians, the 2nd chapter, beginning in verse 18. Listen to what Paul says here. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism. Asceticism is depriving yourself of certain things. So, don't let anyone disqualify you, insisting on asceticism or the worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows through a growth that is from God. The thing I love about this verse is the contrast. The ones who would disqualify you, he says, are doing that without reason by his own sensuous mind, as opposed to holding fast the head, which is Christ. What comes from my mind versus what comes from God's mind. They were establishing their own kind of righteousness. You can see it a little bit later down in verse 21. Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, referring to things that all perish, that are used according to human precepts and teaching. These indeed have an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. Even Paul had to warn Christians then that there were going to be people who would do things that look righteous, that look religious, but they aren't. And brethren, we can easily fall into exactly that same trap of following after a self-made religion that comes from a sensuous mind. And all of us have that sensuous mind as opposed to the holy mind of God. And so because of this, he warns us, they did not, because they're trying to establish their own righteousness, they don't submit to God's righteousness because they don't match, obviously, right? Here's the thing. Some who do this are especially arrogant because they think they know more, they understand better, and they live more righteously than others. And in doing that, they pull us along. We follow after the ones who are often like that. Do you remember how Jesus talked about it in Matthew the 15th chapter as far as not submitting to the righteousness of God? The scribes and the Pharisees came to Jesus and they were accusing the disciples. Why do your disciples break the traditions of the elders, for they don't wash their hands when they eat? So here's again the traditions of the elders. You wash your hands before you eat. This was not at all about washing away germs that were on your hand. It was a ceremonial cleansing. And the most, for a lot of the Pharisees, it was in case they had been out in public and they had touched a Gentile, or they had touched something a Gentile had touched, they needed to cleanse their hands ceremonially so that they didn't contaminate themselves. So they always washed their hands in this way. Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? Jesus turns around right to them and says, why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? And he gave the example of how they didn't submit themselves to God's righteousness. He goes right to one of the 10 commandments. God said, honor your father and mother. And he throws in that don't revile your father and mother, another part of that law. But they had made a slight change to that. They said, if someone tells their father or mother anything that you could gain that I would give you, it's dedicated to God. I think in Mark, they use the word korban. It's gift. It's a gift. Then he does not need to honor his father or mother. Now you understand the reasoning that's behind this. The reasoning behind this would go something along these lines. If I have something that I could honor my parents with, but instead I'm going to use that gift to honor God with, honoring God is more important than honoring my parents. Right? Honoring God would be more important than honoring my parents, so I just tell them this. Anything that I could use to help you, I'm giving it to God. At what point do the parents stop asking? Right? You know, and do you honor your parents that way? He says, so for the sake of your tradition, you've made void the word of God. You've made it void, meaningless, empty. They had tried to take the idea of honoring God and honoring your parents and put them as opposed to each other, and one was greater than the other. Do we do the same thing? Can we fall into exactly that same kind of trap? And that's why he goes on to quote Isaiah. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Their lips said, we're honoring God and we're honoring our parents by doing this. Their heart wasn't anywhere near, because God wanted them to actually honor their parents and do what was necessary to help them. So what does it mean to humble myself so that I'm zealous in a way that honors God? I look back to Psalm 119. Just one section of it. I'm not going to do the whole psalm. The beginning of verse 137. The writer, I think, makes an incredible plea about this kind of zealousness that's humble. Psalm 119, beginning of verse 137. Righteous are you, O Jehovah, and right are your rules. So the first thing that he understands is who God is, right? And the quality of God and of his rules. Verse 138. You have appointed your testimonies in righteousness and in all faithfulness. God has given us these things for our benefit, right? He's faithful and righteous in providing them for us. Verse 139. My zeal consumes me because my foes forget your words. So, I want to be faithful to you. Even though other people are going to forget, I have that dedication. Verse 140. Your promise is well tried, and your servant loves it. I love this part of it because I think it gets to the heart of this. God's wisdom is both recognized in these rules and this righteousness that's revealed. God's wisdom is recognized, it's appreciated, and it's followed. Isn't that what he's saying? Your promise is well tried. It's there for me. So I'm zealous for it. I love it. Verse 141. I am small and despised, yet I don't forget your precepts. Great people tend to, others who think greatly of themselves will forget the precepts. He says, I just keep on obeying God. Your righteousness is righteous forever, and your law is true. This exalts God's righteousness above our I think so's. Man can't match these things. Now listen to 143 especially. Trouble and anguish have found me out, but your commandments are my delight. Trouble and anguish have found me. Life is sometimes really hard and difficult, but that's no reason to stop obeying God and submitting to His righteousness. Isn't that the problem that King Saul found himself in? He found himself as leader of the people and fairly new at it. He was in a troubled spot. And so he broke God's law. The psalmist is saying, trouble and anguish, they find me out, but I keep on obeying. I delight in that. 144, your testimonies are righteous forever. Give me understanding that I may live. So he ends this little section with not only that expressed desire, but an actual prayer to understand. That goes back to the knowledge that we're talking about earlier, isn't it? We've got to pray about that. The last thing I want to note from this passage is that zeal that honors God requires faith. Because he says in verse 4, Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. I understand that faith in these passages it's not just an acknowledgement of who God is, but also a trust in Him. And I see that in this passage. Who do I trust? Who do I really trust? Do I trust myself? It was King Saul who said, I forced myself. I felt compelled. It was Saul that said, I thought I ought to do these things. I was convinced that I ought to do these things. If you trust yourself, you're almost always going to go the way that you want to go. Is it the traditions of my fathers that I trust? It's clear from God's interaction with Saul and with the Sadducees and the Pharisees, that's not sufficient. I need to be one who trusts God. And so when Paul said in 1 Corinthians 2 that when he came to Corinth, he said, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Where was his faith? It wasn't in himself. It wasn't in traditions. It was in God. I know nothing except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Zeal that honors God requires that kind of faith that says, I trust Him and I'm going to go with that. Be zealous for God, but be zealous for God in a way that honors Him. Know His will, humble yourself to His will, trust that this is right and best, and then be like that servant in Psalm 119, delight in it, and let that zeal consume you, and you're going to honor God by that. We want to offer an invitation this morning. If anyone is here, you need our prayers or your help. If you believe that Jesus is the Christ and you want to be baptized, please come forward as we stand and sing.